Good evening, dreamers. Welcome back to the Gentle Knight's Voice, where every story drifts you into dreams. Tonight we're easing into history, not with noise, but with a calm breath and a steady light. If quiet, thoughtful storytelling helps you unwind, consider subscribing, only if you truly enjoy what we do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see our night crew spread across the world. Now, dim the lights. Let a fan hum softly in the background. Settle your shoulders and breathe. When you're ready, we'll begin. We open on a continent balanced on a knife's edge. The year is 1914, and the great powers of Europe stand divided into two rival camps. On one side, the triple entente of France, Britain and Russia, bound together by their shared fear and suspicion of Europe's newest powerhouse, Germany. Opposing them stands the Triple Alliance, Germany itself, fearful of being encircled by its rivals, the fragile Austro-Hungarian Empire, clinging to its ancient glory, and Italy, watching and waiting for a chance to profit at France's expense. The spark that would ignite the powder keg came on a summer's day, June 28th, in the city of Sarajevo. There, a 19-year-old Slav nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped from a crowd and assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Austro-Hungary, seizing the moment, accused its Balkan rival Serbia of aiding the assassin and delivered a brutal ultimatum, demanding humiliating concessions. When Serbia refused, Austro-Hungary declared war. Within hours, Austrian shells began to fall on Belgrade. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, feeling honor, bound to defend his fellow Slavs, ordered the vast Russian army to mobilize. In Berlin, German Emperor Wilhelm II, who had long promised his support to Austro-Hungary, saw his moment. He and his generals believed war with Russia was inevitable, and better to fight it now, before Russian strength grew even greater. They used the Russian mobilization as their justification. Germany mobilized its own mighty armies and declared war on Russia. Knowing this meant war with Russia's ally, France, Germany activated the Schlieffen plan, a bold strategy to avoid a war on two fronts. Its armies would first sweep through neutral Belgium in a great arc, encircling and crushing the French forces near Paris for a swift victory. Only then would they turn east to deal with the slow, moving Russian giant. And so, Germany declared war on France. Across Europe, 6 million men began their march to war. Italy, however, stepped back. The terms of its alliance did not require it to join an offensive war. Across the Atlantic, the United States too declared its neutrality, with President Wilson and the American public wishing to stay clear of Europe's quarrel. Britain was France's ally, but its entry was not certain. That changed when German troops crossed into Belgium, a nation whose neutrality Britain had sworn to protect. An ultimatum was sent from London to Berlin, demanding a withdrawal. It was ignored. Britain declared war. A British expeditionary force landed in France, while the mighty German advance was delayed for crucial days by stubborn Belgian resistance at the fortress, city of Legie. In their frustration, German troops committed terrible massacres against Belgian civilians. Allied propaganda inflated these atrocities, turning global opinion against Germany. Unaware of the great German sickle swinging toward them, the French launched their own Plan 17, an offensive into German territory. In the Battle of the Frontiers, they were thrown back with enormous losses on both sides. The British expeditionary force met the Germans at Mons but, heavily outnumbered, was soon forced into a desperate retreat alongside the French. The Allies made their final stand at the River Marne, just 40 miles from Paris. In a desperate counterattack, they saved the city and hurled the Germans back. 250,000 men fell in the fighting. What followed was the race to the sea, as each army tried to outflank the other to the north. This series of clashes culminated in the First Battle of Ypres, where the Allies, at a terrible cost, finally held the line and prevented a German breakthrough. Exhausted, the two great armies dug in along a 350-mile front, seeking shelter from the storm of steel, the machine guns and artillery shells. Trench warfare had begun. At sea, British warships won the first naval engagement at Heligoland Bight, sinking 3 German cruisers. Britain's Royal Navy, the most powerful in the world, now threw a naval blockade around Germany, strangling its ports and preventing vital supplies, including food, from getting through. The goal was to cripple the German economy and force a surrender. But a week later, a new weapon emerged from the depths. The British cruiser HMS Pathfinder became the first ship in history to be sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. German U-boats, with a vast range of 9,000 miles, could now strike unseen from beneath the waves, presenting a deadly new challenge to British naval dominance. On the Eastern Front, Russian armies surged into East Prussia, only to blunder into a masterpiece of destruction at the Battle of Tannenberg. Their generals von Hindenburg and Ludendorff annihilated an entire Russian army, capturing 90,000 men, a victory aided by the Russians transmitting their uncoded plans over the radio. A second German victory at the Masurian Lakes forced a full Russian retreat, costing them nearly 1/3 men in just 6 weeks. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungary's invasion of Serbia met with a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Sir. Their offensive against Russia also ended in disaster and retreat, with over 300,000 men lost. The fortress town of Przemysl was cut off and besieged by the Russians. The Germans were forced to intervene, launching a diversionary attack toward Warsaw that led to weeks of brutal winter, fighting around the Polish city of Udi, with no decisive result. As the war expanded, the Turkish Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, declaring war on its old enemy Russia. Turkish warships bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea, while Russian troops crossed into the Turkish Caucasus. The conflict was now global, raging across the world's oceans and in far-flung colonies. German troops crossed into British East Africa's modern Kenya, while Allied forces seized the German colony of Togoland, modern Togo. But the British invasion of German Cameroon was defeated at Garua and Nansanakong. A 3,000-strong force attacking German South, West Africa, modern Namibia, was captured at Sandfontein. A month later, a British landing at Tanga ended in chaos and defeat at the hands of a much smaller German force, led by the cunning Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck. Cut off from Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck would wage a brilliant guerrilla campaign, tying down vast numbers of Allied troops for the rest of the war. In Asia, Japan honoured its treaty with Britain and declared war on Germany, seizing the German naval base at Tsingtao. German Samoa and New Guinea fell to troops from New Zealand and Australia. But in the Pacific, off the coast of Chile, German Admiral von Spee's powerful East Asia squadron sank 2 British cruisers at the Battle of Coronel. Both ships were lost with all hands. 5 weeks later, vengeance came at the Falkland Islands, where a British task force sank 4 of von Spee's 5 cruisers. The Admiral went down with his flagship. In the Middle East, British troops seized the Ottoman port of Basra, securing access to the vital Persian oil that fueled the British fleet. That winter, Austrian troops finally captured Belgrade, but the Serbs launched a fierce counterattack and drove them out once more. The fighting in Serbia had already cost around 200,000 casualties on each side. In the North Sea, German warships conducted a hit and run raid on English coastal towns, shelling Hartlepool, Whitby and Scarborough, killing more than 100 civilians. On the Western Front, the French launched their first major offensive against the German lines. The First Battle of Champagne yielded small gains, at a cost of 90,000 casualties. In the Caucasus, an Ottoman offensive through the frozen mountains in midwinter ended in catastrophe at Sarajevo. Turkish casualties totaled 60,000, many frozen to death. And yet, on that first Christmas, a moment of humanity pierced the darkness. Along some sectors of the Western Front, a short truce was held, and men from both sides met in no man's land for games of football. The Great War was just 5 months old, and already around 1 million soldiers had fallen. A war that began in the Balkans had engulfed much of the world. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, now fought the Allies Britain, France, Russia, Serbia and Montenegro, Belgium and Japan. In the east, the Russian army had suffered a string of massive defeats but fought on. Austro-Hungarian troops, too, had suffered huge losses and were humiliated by their failure to defeat tiny Serbia. In the freezing Caucasus Mountains, Russian and Ottoman forces battled the elements and each other. On the Western Front, the French, British, and Belgians faced the Germans from trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. In a new kind of terror, Germany sent 2 giant airships, known as Zeppelins, to bomb Britain. They hit the ports of King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth, damaging houses and killing 4 civilians. At sea, at the Battle of Dogger Bank, the British Navy sank 1 German cruiser, but the rest of the German squadron escaped. Britain's command of the seas allowed its blockade of Germany to tighten, preventing vital supplies, including food, from getting through. Germany retaliated with its own blockade. It declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, where its U-boats would attack Allied merchant ships without warning. Britain relied on imported food. Germany planned to starve it into surrender. On the Eastern Front, German Field Marshal von Hindenburg launched a winter offensive and inflicted another massive defeat on the Russian army at the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes. The Russians lost up to 200,000 men, half of them surrendering amid freezing winter conditions. They found more success against Austria, Hungary, where the city of Przemysl fell after a 4-month siege, netting the Russians 100,000 prisoners. Austria, Hungary's total losses now reached 2 million. Meanwhile, the British and French sent warships to the Dardanelles to threaten Constantinople, the capital of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They believed a show of force would quickly cause Turkey to surrender. They bombarded Turkish shore forts in the narrow straits, but 3 battleships were sunk by mines and 3 more damaged. The attack was called off. On the Western Front, the British attacked at Neuve-Chapelle. The advance was soon halted by German barbed wire and machine guns. British and Indian units suffered 11,000 casualties, about a quarter of the attacking force. 6 weeks later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans attacked with poison gas for the first time on the Western Front. A cloud of lethal chlorine gas forced Allied troops to abandon their trenches. But the Germans didn't have enough reserves ready to exploit the advantage. Soldiers on both sides were quickly supplied with crude gas masks as a chemical weapons arms race began. The Allies landed ground troops at Gallipoli, including men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs. Their goal was to take out the shore forts that were preventing Allied warships from reaching Constantinople, but they immediately met fierce Turkish resistance and were pinned down close to the shore. The day before the landings, the Ottoman Empire began the systematic deportation and murder of ethnic Armenians living within its borders. The Armenians were a long, persecuted minority suspected of supporting Turkey's enemies. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were transported to the Syrian desert and left to die. In all, more than 1 million Armenians perished. The Allies condemned the events as a crime against humanity and civilization, and promised to hold the perpetrators criminally responsible. To this day, the Turkish government disputes the death toll and that these events constituted a genocide. On the Eastern Front, a joint German and Austro-Hungarian offensive in Galicia broke through Russian defences, recapturing Przemysl and taking 100,000 prisoners. It was the beginning of a steady advance against Russian forces. At sea, the British passenger liner Lusitania, sailing from New York to Liverpool, was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland without warning. 1,198 passengers and crew perished, including 128 Americans. US President Woodrow Wilson and the American public were outraged. But Germany insisted the liner was a fair target, as the British used her to carry military supplies. In May, the Allies launched the Second Battle of Artois in another effort to break through the German lines. The French made the main attack at Vimy Ridge, while the British launched supporting attacks at Aubers Ridge and Festubert. The Allies sustained 130,000 casualties and advanced just a few thousand yards. That summer, above the Western Front, the Fokker Eindecker helped Germany win control of the air. It was one of the first aircraft with a machine gun able to fire forward through its propeller, thanks to a new invention known as an interrupter gear. Allied aircraft losses mounted rapidly in what became known as the Fokker Scourge. Italy, swayed by British and French promises of territorial gains at Austro-Hungarian expense, joined the Allies, declaring war on Austria, Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Germany. The Italian army made its first assault against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River, but was repulsed with heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Allies faced a crisis on the Eastern Front. The Russians had begun a general retreat, abandoning Poland. German troops entered Warsaw on August 5th. Tsar Nicholas II dismissed the army's commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, and took personal command. It would prove disastrous for the Tsar, as he became more and more closely tied to Russian military defeat. At Gallipoli, the Allies landed reinforcements at Suvla Bay, but neither they nor a series of fresh attacks by the Annexics could break the deadlock. Conditions for both sides were terrible. Troops were tormented not only by the enemy but by heat, flies, and sickness. In the Atlantic, a German U-boat sank the liner SS Arabic 40. 4 were lost, including 3 Americans. In response to further US warnings, Germany ended all attacks on passenger ships. On the Western Front, the Allies mounted their biggest offensive of the war so far, designed to smash through the front and take pressure off their beleaguered Russian ally. The French attacked in the Third Battle of Artois and Second Battle of Champagne. The British, with the help of poison gas, attacked at Loos. Despite initial gains, the attack soon got bogged down with enormous losses on all sides. Allied troops landed at Salonika in Greece to open a new front against the Central Powers and bring aid to Serbia. But the Allies were too late. Bulgaria joined the Central Powers, and their joint offensive overran Serbia in 2 months. That winter, the remnants of the Serbian army escaped through the Albanian mountains. Their losses were horrific. By the end of the war, a third of Serbia's army had been killed, the highest proportion of any nation. Fierce fighting continued on the Italian front as Italian troops launched the third and fourth battles of the Isonzo. Austro-Hungarian forces, though outnumbered, were dug in on the high ground and impossible to dislodge. In the Middle East, a British advance on Baghdad was blocked by Turkish forces at the Battle of Ctesiphon. 25 miles south of the city, the British withdrew to Kut, where they were besieged. The Allies abandoned the Gallipoli campaign. 83,000 troops were secretly evacuated without alerting Turkish forces. Not a man was lost. It was one of the best executed plans of the war. The campaign had cost both sides 250,000 casualties. 1915 was a bad year for the Allies. Enormous losses for no tangible gains. But there was no talk of peace. Instead, all sides prepared for even bigger offensives in 1916, with new tactics developed from earlier failures. All sides still believed a decisive battlefield victory was within grasp. World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war. But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe, while thousands of women had entered the workforce, replacing the men sent to fight in their millions. All sides were preparing for a long war. The war had raged for a year and a half as the Allies continued to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria. At sea, the British maintained their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials. Germany had retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but had to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens had already been caught in the crossfire. On the Western Front, French, British, and Belgian troops were dug in opposite the Germans, both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, the Russians had ended their long retreat and stabilized the line, but their army had suffered huge losses. On the Italian front, Italian troops had launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defences. While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers had overrun Serbia, whose army was forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains. Now, on January 5th, Austro-Hungarian troops attacked Montenegro. They were delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac, but 3 weeks later Montenegro was forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, the Russians launched a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupied the city of Erzurum. In April, they captured the Black Sea port of Trebizond. Meanwhile, the British transported 2 motor boats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrived after a 10,000-mile trip by sea and land and helped the British seize control of the strategic lake from local German forces. The same month, in German Cameroon, German troops, besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months, finally surrendered to the Allies. It marked the end of the Cameroon campaign. On the Western Front, the Germans unleashed a devastating assault on the French fortress, town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knew France would defend this symbolic town to the last man. His plan, in his own words, was to bleed France white in its defense. It was the strategy of attrition. Verdun became one of the most terrifying battles of the war. A mincing machine where infantry divisions were destroyed almost as fast as they could be fed into the line. In Britain, 1 million men had already volunteered for military service, but the government realized it would not be enough, so in March 1916, Britain became the last major power to introduce conscription. That spring on the Western Front, British troops were the last to be issued with steel helmets. The nature of trench warfare produced a high proportion of head wounds, the German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet offered limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel. Neutral Portugal had been co-operating with the British, which seemed to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony, Portuguese Angola. On March 9th, Germany retaliated by declaring war on Portugal. On the Eastern Front, Russia launched an attack near Lake Naroch to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. But it was a disaster. There were 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack failed to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun. In Dublin, Irish Republicans launched an armed revolt against British rule. It became known as the Easter Rising, and was put down after 6 days of street fighting. In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrendered. General Townshend led 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later died from starvation or disease. Britain wanted Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, so it had promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war. But now Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning, after the war, to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control. Unaware of this deal, Hussein bin Ali, Sheriff of Mecca, led the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule in the Battle of Mecca. His forces seized control of the Holy City. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces launched a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defences gave way. Austro-Hungarian troops were poised to break through into northern Italy. That month, in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashed with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. In the only major naval battle of the war, the British suffered heavier losses, but claimed victory as the German fleet withdrew and did not emerge from its base for the rest of the war. For the summer of 1916, the Allies had planned major, simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers from east and west. Now they were needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. The Russians launched their attack first on the Eastern Front. General Alexei Brusilov had carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops broke through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles and taking 200,000 prisoners. This brilliant though costly Russian attack achieved its aim as the Central Powers were forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line. At sea, the British cruiser HMS Hampshire, en route to Russia, hit a mine and sank off Orkney. Among the 650 dead was Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. 3 days later in the Adriatic, the Italian troopship Principe Umberto was sunk by a German submarine. It was the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost. On the Western Front, Britain and France launched their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes were high for a breakthrough, but the first day was a disaster. A long Allied artillery bombardment failed to knock out German defences, and waves of British infantry were cut down by machine gun fire as they advanced into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffered 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed. It was the worst day in the history of the British Army. But more attacks were ordered, and the battle would rage for another 5 months. Encouraged by the Russian advance, Romania joined the Allies. But despite an initially successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faced a counter-offensive from German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The Allied force at Salonika tried to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there were small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevented a breakthrough. On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally called off the attack at Verdun. The French army had honoured their commander, General Nivel's promise, "Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass." But victory came at a terrible price: 365,000 casualties. The Germans lost almost as many. Verdun remains one of the bloodiest battles in human history. For his defeat at Verdun, Falkenhayn was sacked, and Germany's heroes of the Eastern Front, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, took command in the west. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Somme continued. Near the village of Flers, the British introduced a new weapon they hoped could break the deadlock of the trenches. It was called the tank. But despite some small successes, the first tanks were too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact. On the Eastern Front, Russia's Brusilov offensive came to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it is clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses. Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovered. On the Italian front, heavy fighting raged throughout the autumn as Italian forces made repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme came to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies had advanced 10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties. German losses were about 450,000. The Allies reassured themselves that this was a winning strategy because, at this rate, Germany would run out of men first. Meanwhile, disaster engulfed Romania as the country was overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffered 250,000 casualties. The remnants of its army took position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, died. He was succeeded by his great-nephew, Karl. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith was forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George, while General Joffre was replaced as French commander-in-chief by General Nivelle, who promised victory through bold, aggressive action. Amid the comings and goings, US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement came to nothing. Neither side was willing to make concessions. In 1916, World War I became a war of attrition. Both sides began to focus less on winning victory on the battlefield than on grinding down the enemy and inflicting such enormous losses they would be forced to surrender. In 1917, the strategy would push Europe's major powers to the brink of collapse. Germany knew it would lose a long war of attrition against the Allies, who had greater resources. So its leaders gambled. They resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, believing their U-boats could cut off Britain's food imports by sea and starve the country into surrender within 6 months. But the new shoot-on-sight tactics meant neutral American ships would inevitably be caught in the crossfire, risking America joining the war on the Allied side. Just 2 days into the campaign, the SS Housatonic, an American steamer carrying wheat from Galveston, Texas to England, was sunk by a U-boat. The British then passed to the US government a telegram they had intercepted from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. Germany was encouraging Mexico to attack America if America and Germany ended up at war. The so-called Zimmermann telegram put yet more pressure on US President Wilson to declare war on Germany. In Russia, enormous casualties and bread shortages led to riots and revolution. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government took charge, pledging to continue the war. But at the front, Russian troops began to desert en masse. After a string of German provocations, the US finally declared war on Germany. It brought immense resources to the Allied cause, but they would take many months to mobilize, and the German gamble of unrestricted submarine warfare may still pay off. April was the U-boats' most successful month of the war. They sank 6,000 tons of Allied shipping, an average of 17 ships a day, all packed with urgently needed food and supplies. Britain would face starvation if the U-boats were not defeated soon. On the Western Front, the British launched the Battle of Arras, a diversion to support a major, upcoming French offensive. After heavy fighting, Canadian troops seized the high ground of Vimy Ridge. It was a limited Allied victory, but cost 150,000 Allied casualties to 130,000 German. Above the trenches, the First Air War had reached new levels of sophistication and deadliness. Reconnaissance aircraft were crucial for spotting enemy positions and directing artillery fire onto them. Scout aircraft, or fighters, tried to shoot them down before they could execute their mission. New models of aircraft were developed every few months. But that spring, the superiority of German aircraft led to heavy Allied losses in what became known as Bloody April. 3 days after the fall of Vimy Ridge, French General Robert Nivelle launched his main offensive. Expectations were high, but after initial success, the advance bogged down and casualties quickly mounted on both sides. The apparently senseless losses caused morale in the French army to collapse. Whole units mutinied, refusing to attack. General Nivelle was sacked as French commander-in-chief and replaced by General Pétain, hero of Verdun, who promised no more suicidal attacks. That summer, at Messines Ridge, the British tunneled under the German lines and detonated 19 enormous mines under the enemy position. It was the largest man-made explosion in history to date and paved the way to a brilliant but highly local British victory. In Greece, King Constantine, who had favoured neutrality, was forced to abdicate, and Greece joined the Allies. Russia's provisional government ordered a new attack, but the July offensive was a disaster. The morale and discipline of the Russian army had collapsed. It could no longer be relied on to fight, and the Central Powers' counterattack was almost unopposed. At sea, the Allies began to group their merchant ships into convoys, which sailed under naval escort. The new system led to a steady fall in losses. The tide was turning in the U-boat war. As discontent with the war grew in Germany, the German parliament, the Reichstag, passed a peace resolution, calling for peace of understanding and reconciliation. It was ignored by the German High Command, which now effectively ruled the country as a military dictatorship. In Belgium, the British launched their major offensive of 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres. It would be remembered as Passchendaele. Heavy shelling, rain, and broken irrigation channels turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. In these impossible conditions, all hopes of a breakthrough soon faded. The attack was called off after 3 months, by which point the British had suffered 240,000 casualties, the Germans 200,000. On the Italian front, at the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces battered each other into exhaustion. There were 150,000 Italian casualties, 100,000 Austro-Hungarian. That year, 1917, the list of Allied nations grew. Brazil, Liberia, China, and Siam all declared war on Germany as a result of German U-boat attacks or to curry favour with the Allies. China would contribute many thousands of labourers, working for the Allies in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. That year in the Middle East, British forces avenged their 1916 humiliation at Kut by defeating the Ottoman Turks and marching on to occupy Baghdad. British forces in Egypt advanced across the Sinai Desert, but were thrown back by Ottoman forces at the First and Second Battles of Gaza. In July, Arab rebels captured the strategic Ottoman port of Aqaba. They were accompanied by a British military advisor, Captain T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. That autumn, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for the creation of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. The aim was to rally Jewish support for the Allies, but the declaration contradicted existing pledges to Arab leaders. In October, the British finally won at Gaza, clearing the way for an advance into Palestine. 6 weeks later, General Allenby led British troops into Jerusalem, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. With Russian forces in disarray, Germany was able to move troops from the east to the Italian front. At the Battle of Caporetto, they helped to smash through the Italian army, advancing 70 miles and taking 250,000 prisoners. British and French divisions, desperately needed on the Western Front, had to be redeployed to shore up the line. In Russia, a second revolution brought Lenin's Bolshevik party to power. He was determined to end Russia's involvement in the war. In France, Georges Clemenceau became prime minister. Nicknamed the Tiger, he promised total war and total victory. But for the Allies in late 1917, final victory looked uncertain. Russia had stopped fighting. French armies were recovering from mutiny, the Italian front had almost collapsed, and American reinforcements still seemed a long way off. For the time being, the British were the only effective Allied force in the field. So the British attacked at Cambrai with the first major tank assault in history. On the first day, nearly 400 tanks spearheaded an advance of several miles through German defences. But then the tanks broke down or were knocked out. The Germans rushed in reinforcements, and the gains were lost. Finland declared independence from Russia. Romania, isolated by the Russian collapse, signed an armistice with the Central Powers. 6 days later, Russia also signed an armistice. The Allied Eastern Front was no more. 1917 had seen one major Allied power, Russia, knocked out of the war, with the arrival of a fresh, new ally, America. Germany knew only military victory, could now save it from being overwhelmed by Allied resources, and began planning one last, massive onslaught for the spring of 1918. 1918. After 3.5 years of war, the Allies were in crisis. Russia had been rocked by revolution, and its new Bolshevik government had signed an armistice with the Central Powers. Thousands of German troops would be freed up to fight on the Western Front, where the carnage of trench warfare had already claimed more than 1 million lives. But Germany was also desperate. Britain's long naval blockade had led to shortages and social unrest at home, while America's entry into the war brought fresh manpower and vast resources to the Allied cause. Germany faced inevitable defeat unless it could win a quick victory on the Western Front. US President Wilson announced his 14 points. They outlined his vision for a post-war world, including an end to secret treaties, a reduction in the size of armed forces, self-determination for the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and an international organization to settle future disputes. But most European leaders dismissed his ideas as wishful thinking. At Brest-Litovsk, Bolshevik Russia signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Russia gave up vast amounts of territory in exchange for peace. 500,000 German troops could now be redeployed from the east to the Western Front, where German General Erich Ludendorff planned an all-out, last-ditch offensive to win the war. Ludendorff's spring offensive caught the Allies off guard. German stormtroopers, using new infiltration tactics, helped to overwhelm the British Fifth Army, which was soon in full retreat. The German advance threatened to split the British and French armies, with disastrous consequences, so French General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces to coordinate strategy. Outside Amiens, British and Australian troops improvised a defence and finally halted the German advance. The German offensive switched to the north, targeting the Channel ports. But the British inflicted heavy losses on the Germans and prevented a breakthrough. Above the trenches, the First Air War continued to escalate. Each side now had more than 3,000 aircraft in service on the Western Front. But by 1918 the Allies had won air superiority thanks to greater resources. On April 21st, Germany's most famous pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was shot down and killed near Amiens. With 80 victories, he was the war's highest scoring ace and was buried by the Allies with full military honours. Britain's new independent bombing force launched a daylight raid against Cologne. It marked the beginning of Britain's own strategic bombing campaign. On the ground, Ludendorff's offensive switched south, targeting the French. German troops advanced 30 miles, but were halted at the River Marne, just as fresh American divisions entered the line. The US 1st Division was the first to see combat at the Battle of Cantigny. 3 days later, the US 2nd Division won victory at the Battle of Belleau Wood. By now there were nearly 1 million American soldiers in France, with 10,000 more arriving every day. The fourth phase of the German offensive led to a 9-mile advance, but was finally halted by a French counterattack. In Italy, Austria, Hungary launched an attack at Asiago and the Piave River to support Ludendorff's offensive in France. But it was repulsed with heavy losses, and morale amongst the Austro-Hungarian army collapsed. British and French troops landed at Murmansk in northern Russia. It was the beginning of Allied intervention in Russia's civil war on the side of so-called white or anti-Bolshevik forces. On the Western Front, the Germans' final attack was defeated in the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff's offensive had cost the Germans more than 600,000 casualties and had failed to make a decisive breakthrough. Germany's final gamble had failed. The Allies now went on the attack. At the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian and French troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, advanced 7 miles in a single day. General Ludendorff called August 8th the Black Day of the German army. German troops were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized and began to surrender in their thousands. The Battle of Amiens began the Allies. 100 days offensive trench warfare was over. The Germans were in full retreat. In the Balkans, a new Allied offensive at Dobropol broke through Bulgarian positions. The overstretched Bulgarian army collapsed, and 2 weeks later Bulgaria signed an armistice. In the Middle East, British-led forces defeated the Turks at the Battle of Megiddo, taking 25,000 prisoners. Allied troops soon occupied Damascus and Aleppo. On the Western Front, Marshal Foch ordered a general attack. British, French, and American armies reached the Hindenburg Line, a line of reinforced German defences, and broke through. Ludendorff informed the Kaiser that the military situation was hopeless and that Germany must seek an armistice. Germany sent a request to US President Woodrow Wilson, who, in return, demanded German withdrawal from all occupied territory and the Kaiser's abdication. On the Italian front, the Allies delivered the final blow to Austria-Hungary at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army disintegrated and 300,000 prisoners were taken. With the Central Powers facing collapse, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice with the Allies at Mudros. 4 days later, Austria-Hungary signed an armistice with the Allies at Villa Giusti. At Kiel, the German High Seas Fleet was ordered to make a suicidal attack on the British Navy, but instead it mutinied. Revolution spread through Germany. The Kaiser abdicated and a German republic was proclaimed. On November 11, 1918, a German delegation signed an armistice with the Allies inside Marshal Foch's railway carriage at Compiègne. It came into force at 11 a.m., but fighting continued until the last moment. American Private Henry Gunther was killed charging a German machine gun at 10:59. He is thought to be the last soldier killed during World War I. 3 days later, in East Africa, German General von Lettow-Vorbeck surrendered his army on the Chambezi River. For 4 years, he had tied down huge numbers of Allied troops, remaining undefeated while cut off from home. He is still considered one of history's greatest guerrilla leaders. The Paris Peace Conference opened at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the French capital. Delegates accepted a proposal to create a League of Nations to settle future international disputes. The Versailles Treaty, signed in June, imposed harsh terms on Germany. Its military was restricted in size. It must pay war reparations to the Allies. It lost territory to its neighbours, and its colonies were seized by the victors. Germany must also accept responsibility for the war in a war guilt clause, a source of lasting resentment in Germany. The boundaries of Europe were redrawn. Poland re-emerged after 100 years of foreign rule, while Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an enlarged Romania emerged from the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled. New states, most under European control, were created in the Middle East. Here, as in Europe, the seeds of future conflict were sown. While in the Far East, former German possessions in China were handed to Japan, to China's outrage. World War I claimed the lives of 9.5 million soldiers. 1 in 8 of those who fought. 21 million more were wounded. 7 million civilians also lost their lives. Huge areas of Europe were left devastated. Old empires vanished. New states were born. Lives across the world were transformed. The world was never the same again.